Morning, evening, afternoon to those of you here. Delighted as always to be part of RightsCon. For the second year running, really, RightsCon is helping set the tone for how we can have meaningful, I believe we're live, morning. If it doesn't work to toggle through the RightsCon and Zoom platforms, as I've found out. I'm joined here by a fantastic group of people, and we're on a Zoom platform, and you're all logged in on the RightsCon platform. So apologies in advance for any a lag in the conversation and in the chat, but our colleagues at RightsCon will help us look at both together. Just the other tech note before we start, we do hope we'll hear a lot more from all of you. And so do keep your questions and comments coming in, but also let us know if you'd like to jump in at any point in the conversation, and we'd love to hear from you. So I'm Tonu Basu. I lead the policy work at Open Government Partnership. For those of you who don't know OGP, we're a multi-stakeholder, multilateral partnership of 78 countries and over 70 local governments, working with civil society, business, media across all of these member countries. And the goal is really to ensure that policies across sectors like algorithms and AI policy are transparent, accountable, and responsive to the public through what we call OGP action plans that are independently then assessed for completion and emission. In our experience, through the 10 years that that OGP has been around and the commitments we've seen across the world, opening up information, data, processes make governments function better. Now, OGP action plans and OGP member countries have been used to tackle a variety of digital challenges and provide and promote digital innovation, from citizen participation in policy making to opening up data, whether on procurement or on public services. However, and we've seen that across the RightsCon calendar, the past few years, there's been growing challenges, both related to misuse of digital technologies as well as lack of safeguards to protect digital rights. And this is one of the conversations we hope will address some of that. Within OGP, we have seen a first wave of implementers working on policy commitments related to algorithmic transparency and accountability. We have been convening a group of countries that have been implementing and initiating algorithmic accountability tools, policy tools, through their OGP action plans. And these include New Zealand, France, Netherlands, Canada, and several others, several local governments, and we have some of them in the conversation today. We have also been convening an informal network of implementing officials working on this who bounce off ideas off of each other, especially because this is such a nascent area in terms of implementation of policy and track record globally. Now, if you have any questions about OGP, I have some colleagues on the RightsCon platform and we'll be happy to discuss that more with you. Now, on to our fantastic panel today. In today's discussion, we hope to get into some specific efforts around these policy interventions, as I mentioned, and a specific focus on how to learn from each other, especially around areas of citizen engagement and raising citizen awareness. I am delighted to be joined by some of the people you see on screen today. We have Jenny Brennan, Senior Researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute, Jared Mackley-Crump, Advisor of System and Partnerships at Stats New Zealand, Government of New Zealand, Natalia Domagala, Head of Data Ethics at the Cabinet Office in the UK Government, Lawrence Miller, Transparency International New Zealand, Soise Pennicott, Head of Capacity and Community Building at ETA Lab, Government of France, and Fabrizio Scrolini, Executive Director from the Latin America Open Data Initiative, or ILDA, as several of you know. So we have people joining in at 5 a.m. their time and 8 p.m. their time, and thanks so much for this wonderful group to do that. Now, jumping into the conversation, one of the things we've seen from several of you as in the informal conversations we've had as part of the algorithms network that OGP's convened, but also a joint study that we've undertaken with the Ada Lovelace Institute and AI Now, which looks at the first wave of policy interventions, we've seen that civic engagement and citizen engagement initiatives in algorithmic policy have not been, there is great potential to do more. They have not been so many. And that's one of the things we hope we can get into a little bit more in today's panel. We'll start with a broad overview and really get into what do we understand as we see this first wave of algorithmic accountability policy initiatives, and then how can we think more about citizen engagement there. Now, before we go in to the panel, I'd request my colleagues from OGP to maybe share a Jamboard with you, because I do want to hear about algorithmic accountability initiatives in your countries, and hopefully we can bring you into the conversation and hear more about that. So the two questions we're asking through the Jamboard is, has there been any discussion on the mainstream media in your country about algorithms, and are you aware of any initiatives being taken by your government? Now, to help us get into more detail, we first have Jenny Brennan from the Ada Lovelace Institute, and that's one of the foremost research organizations working on this issue. Jenny, can you give us a little bit of a scene setter? What's the landscape of policy interventions around algorithmic accountability look like at the moment?
Absolutely. We've seen the expansion of algorithmic systems across the public sector and around the world, from AI streaming tools to prioritize immigration applications and predictive analytics and policing, to risk scoring systems to support welfare and social care decision-making, to exam grading systems over the pandemic. And with it, there's been a growth in consideration of algorithmic accountability as a research field and within policy interventions. I'm often asked why algorithmic. Aren't these concerns true across the analog, manual public sector as well? But algorithmic systems create distinct challenges. For instance, challenges of scale. They inherently systematize processes, which mean they risk creating new systemic barriers to public services or codifying old ones. And they add a kind of additional layer of opacity, in some cases at the technical level, as computer scientists try and establish how to create explainable machine learning tools, and in others simply at the comprehension level, creating new capacity demand for technical understanding and communication in the public sector, and highlighting gaps between public bodies and industry and procurement. So this lack of transparency and accountability in relation to algorithmic systems risks not only undermining fairness and due process for individuals affected by these systems, but also risks harboring corrosive effects on political institutions, competitive markets, and the democratic legitimacy of governments and public bodies. So kind of where are we now? If we know those are kind of the risks and concerns we're flagging, what kind of challenges and successes have there been around these interventions? As I mentioned, one kind of big challenge has been this lack of basic visibility across jurisdictions. Often we don't know where algorithms are used, by who, for what, who made them. But there is this increasing recognition and attempts to tackle these issues of algorithmic accountability, as we're going to hear about across today's session. And as Tony pointed out, our work with OGP and the AI Now Institute highlights this kind of first wave of policy interventions we're seeing, looking at things from principles and guidelines through to public transparency mechanisms, impact assessments, audits, or special procurement conditions. It's a nascent policy space, so different countries and regions are at different places in that journey. And we haven't necessarily reached the pinnacle of algorithm accountability policy, but we're very much working on the way. And there's a few kind of key challenges and opportunities that come across that, from questions around meaningful transparency. I mentioned the basic visibility issue. But there's also something around how do we go beyond just saying the system exists to helping people really understand and meaningfully engage with that. And part of that is underpinned by a challenge around shared language. I say algorithmic system, you say automated decision-making system, I say AI, you say ML. And that can be both in terms of us having that conversation or us working with local government, regional government, national government partners, but also thinking about it from a kind of policy space and, what is the object of governance or the scope of technologies we're talking about. And then that also feeds into how we do that communication with the public. And this question that I'm really excited we're going to unpack a lot further today around civic participation and how we build up those methods to really help citizens be part of the process of understanding, deciding, and shaping how these technologies are used within their public services. So I'll hand back over to you, Tony. Hopefully that gives a bit of a sense of where we are.
Thanks, Jenny. And I think that you sort of, I think, understanding both where the entry points are, especially around such a range of public services that we've seen this used for, but also very specific tools, whether it's algorithmic sort of assessment, sort of impact assessments, or sort of general transparency principles. I hope we can hear more about some of that from Soysek, from the government of France. Soysek, the government of France is really been one of the first governments to legally mandate algorithmic accountability, and we've seen that also in your OGP action plan. Now, what has been done? What was the impetus? But also, how do you see this landscape play out in France right now?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tonu. So basically, the subject was brought to light in France between 2016 and 2017 through an algorithmic scandal, as it often happens. In France, we have a centralized algorithm for higher education admissions, which I will mention is not machine learning. It is rule-based, but it was very opaque, and there was some controversy about the opacity of the source code, the opacity of the rules, and the fact that we weren't sure if the criteria within the law and the criteria in the source code matched, so if the software was actually implementing the right things. And so that sort of put the topic of algorithmic transparency under the spotlight through student unions, journalists, digital rights associations, human rights associations. And then it just so happened that in 2016, there was a national public consultation for a law called the Digital Republic Law, which reformed some aspects of public law with regards to the new implications of technology for government. And one of the citizen proposals in this national consultation was to add transparency obligations for public agencies within the law. And so in 2016, with this law that was passed, actually the obligations came into play in 2018. There are several of them, but I can give you more info later about them. They're mostly transparency obligations. So after algorithms are implemented and they're about decision-making algorithms, then they can be rule-based systems or machine learning systems, automated decision assisting. And here I refer to Jenny's comment on using a lot of vocabulary, because literally I said a lot of words that might not resonate with you, but we can delve into that later. So that's basically what brought the topic into to the French context. And then we had this legal framework. And there's two things that I would mention that we're working on right now. And so I'm speaking from inside the government, as EtaLab is the French government's task force for open data, open source, and data policy. The first thing that needs to be done is we're trying to bridge the gap between the legal framework that stays very broad and general, and concrete tools for agencies to make algorithms actually accountable and to make their processes accountable. It's not only about the technical things. So for example, we've launched a working group with public servants around public registers to build tools that they can use and that are very operational. But I think also, and we've been also working on algorithmic literacy and awareness about the issue, because it's something that's not necessarily widespread, even though it's more and more well-known within the government. And then the second challenge I would see that ties into our conversation today, looking from outside of government, which is something that public servants sometimes have a difficulty to do, is now in France, we have transparency obligations for agencies, but the main question is, how do we turn these obligations into rights for citizens? And how do they actually ensure algorithmic accountability and not just transparency for the sake of transparency? And I think that's why I'm just really excited to hear about other initiatives to increase citizen engagement and citizen participation into this topic, because I feel like that's the crucial part of the problem. And I will give you back the chair, Tony.
Thanks, Soisik. I think there are a few very interesting things you touched on. Of course, the issue around language that I think Jenny also touched on is a key one, and I hope we can return to that, especially as we hear from our colleagues in New Zealand about engaging citizens and civic public engagement around this issue. The second interesting thing, I think, was around the issue of the scandal. We've heard this in other countries as well, where the conversations around this in the mainstream media start often with a scandal. But I think what was also interesting is how you engage government agencies, so officials and other agencies. I'm curious to hear how some of that could be brought in terms of learning for engaging the public. I want to pause and see if there are any questions for Soisik and Jenny, but I also want to just go to the Jamboard. There have been some interesting conversations happening there too. So in Jordan and Nigeria, well, Jordan, somebody says it's a fairly non-existent conversation. Nigeria, it's only just emerging. But in Norway, in the mainstream media, the conversations have mostly been about how they actually make a difference in people's lives. And so it's more of a positive lens than a negative lens. And some other place not known, it's mostly on the negative side. So you can see in the mainstream media in different countries, it takes very, very different forms, which is extremely interesting, I think. No questions at the moment, so maybe I'll jump right back into the panel and really talk about, well, how do we get public engagement and more citizens involved in this conversation? So moving to a completely different part of the world right now, where it's around probably 8:30 or 9 p.m. I'm looking at sort of when we looked at the first wave of policy interventions on algorithmic transparency and accountability, one of the countries we found some pilot initiatives around this to be New Zealand. And we have colleagues from Stats New Zealand who are currently implementing a set of policies, including the first ever algorithmic charter. And I hope, Jared, you'll tell us a little more about that. And after Jared, we have a colleague from TI New Zealand, as I mentioned, Lawrence, who've been working with the government to implement several of these policies and monitoring how this has been implemented. But also you are looking at ways to improve on what is already there, and that's something you're advocating for. So first, over to you, Jared, to talk a little bit about the charter, ways you're at least thinking about engaging the public in this conversation.
Kia ora, thank you, Tony, very much. It's very nice to be here. So the algorithm charter is almost a year old in terms of when it was launched and first implemented in the middle of the pandemic response last year. But further than that, it was really a couple of years in the making. It arose out of an algorithm assessment report that we did in 2018, which made a number of did an assessment of how algorithms were being used across the country, and came up with a series of recommendations, which went to cabinet ministers, and one of which was endorsed, which was around the creation and introduction of a voluntary algorithm charter. So as I said, launched a year ago. We are coming up to the first anniversary, at which point we will be undertaking an independent review of the charter. We do see it as an evolving piece of work, and we know that there is a lot we will learn from the review, and a lot that we will learn from people's experiences and our own experiences supporting the charter, and are currently kind of thinking about, so what's the next stage in terms of not necessarily how the charter will change, but how the area of algorithmic transparency will change and evolve, and what we need to do as Stats New Zealand, as the data steward of the government data system in New Zealand, what we need to do in response to that to continue to support implementation of the charter, support take-up of the charter. We want to see it across the entire public sector in New Zealand would be great. We have 26 agencies signed up to the charter on a voluntary basis, and that's over half of the public service in New Zealand, and it certainly represents the ministries and agencies that have the biggest usage of data. So the Ministry of Social Development, as one example, the Inland Revenue Taxation Department. So these are the agencies that have massive collections of data, massive use data analytics and algorithms, and obviously making decisions that are impacting New Zealanders every day in the decisions that they make. I think I was asked to kind of reflect on kind of what we've learnt from our engagement with the public over the Charter. We did a round of public consultation in developing the draft Charter. I think there are a few key lessons that I think we've learned from that. The first is that there was a clear desire by the public consultation that the Charter would go further than the draft, and the draft which was created in consultation with agencies who would be implementing the Charter. And the public wanted it to have more regulatory power, to cover more uses of algorithms. So it's just limited to operational algorithms. People wanted it to cover all algorithms, to cover all uses of AI across government, and to have more transparency and accountability mechanisms than were in the draft. So there was the public feedback clearly wanted it to go further, and the Charter had to be a kind of balancing of those kind of competing priorities, I guess, between the public feedback and the agencies that would implement. The second reflection I would make is the need to engage the public early, and also to engage perhaps in a more circular fashion. So it's obviously important to engage the public early. You really want to engage with your key stakeholders to bring them on board and to kind of bring them through the whole journey. It's obviously good open government practice, but also bringing the public feedback in to get that range of expertise. We had some really people who are involved in algorithms and involved in transparency giving us very considered and thoughtful feedback, and obviously it makes the resulting policy mechanism stronger as a result. But I think in reflecting on that, I think in future we've reflected that what we perhaps could have done to improve the engagement was to engage a little bit earlier and more iteratively. So for example, between the publication of the algorithm assessment report and then through to the development of the draft Charter, perhaps there was a period there that we actually could have gone out to the public and got feedback on the report and the recommendations, which then could have fed into the creation of the draft Charter, which then went out for public consultation as well. So you kind of get a more robust, I guess, multi-round of feedback going. In saying that though, in reflecting on that, we are mindful that you can't engage in endless consultation that just goes round and round, and you as always are trying to find a balance that delivers on the policy aims as best as possible. You can't kind of create perfection necessarily first off. And I suppose related to that as well, another reflection is that this, I think, as Soisik commented on, this is a complex area, and although public awareness and certainly concern about issues about algorithmic transparency are increasing all the time, and here in New Zealand there's been quite a lot of media focus this year on the use of particularly algorithms in policing. There's been a lot of high-profile media coverage, and so that, of course, then brings public concern. But it remains a very highly complex and highly technical area, and it's very hard for the general public to understand in a detailed way. And I so think one thing we could have done is to have engaged more proactively in trying to help people to understand what we mean when we talk about algorithmic transparency, and why something like the Algorithm Charter is important for people to engage with, to kind of drive more increased feedback, increased engagement around the Charter. It could have been things like engaging more widely with media, running seminars with civil society, targeting communities who are impacted by the use of algorithms across government. And I think, and just in closing, one area in particular that is important for New Zealand is in the way that government builds partnerships with New Zealand's Indigenous Māori communities. And Stats New Zealand is certainly really pushing a shift in this area. It's one of our 4 key strategic priorities. And kind of as an example, we are at the moment working alongside Māori to create a model for data governance. And obviously that will have implications for all of our work in trust and confidence and transparency and the Algorithm Charter as well. And I suppose in developing our Algorithm Charter kind of a couple of years ago, we could have engaged earlier to build partnerships with Māori to get that input into the Algorithm Charter to help, again, people to understand what we mean when we talk about algorithmic transparency. Yeah, I've some more reflections that maybe we'll get to in the Q&A session, but I guess I'll stop there and hand it back to you for now.
Thanks, Jared. I think there's a lot of fantastic things you covered, and a lot, hopefully, Lawrence will pick up on too. I think it was really great to hear about some of your reflections on how do you balance public consultation with what you get in the final draft. I think in the Open Government Partnership, we've heard that across policy areas, and I saw Natalia and Soysik nod along.
Right.
So
it's an ongoing negotiation, I think.
It's a government civic engagement negotiation, and our civil society colleagues very familiar with that too. The second is how to engage. Like, I think early engagement in OGP, we always say engage early, and you've heard that in development of your OGP action plan as well. But I think is like, I really like what you said around multi-round of feedback. We recognize it's challenging and a lot of logistical conversations involved there. But I think that was interesting as your reflections on engaging the Maori community and how do you make conversations around some of these seemingly esoteric concepts really relevant to communities. Lawrence, you're looking at a commitment in your next action plan as well, building on some of this, as I understand, but also you've been thinking about ways to improve existing policy. Tell us more. Lawrence, you're on mute.
But I'd taken myself off. So I think the role of government working with civil society is to jointly develop policies and practices. I was encouraged by the reports from France, from Soysik, that it's a long way from legislation to operational practices in government agencies. I think our job as civil society organizations is to push government further than they are comfortable to go. I'm a recovering public servant. I've been clean for 12 years now, so but I do know what it's like to be outside government, having been inside government. And you're right, it is, the world looks very different. So our job is to push further, and I'd have to say the OGP is actually a very valuable mechanism that, by securing commitments in the OGP, that creates a pressure in government that works alongside what civil society are doing. So we're just in the process of developing our 4th National Action Plan in New Zealand, and we've taken some conventional and maybe some stronger lines. One is update the charter. Jared mentioned the review. We want to update it based on the review, and we want to make it add a level of compulsion, like you were talking about in France. We're also quite concerned that personal information is finding its way into third-party commercial providers who are not necessarily subject to the same constraints around the use of personal data that the government agencies are, and therefore act as data consolidators and aggregators of government data. And we think that that's important, that that particular area is regulated and not just subject to contracts between individual government agencies and the third-party provider. And fourthly, and probably most controversially, and Jared referred to it, we think facial recognition technology, which is actually a particular example of algorithms and transparency, we think we've got a number of pilots that have been under the radar in New Zealand, specifically in the criminal justice system, and we think they should be stopped until we've got a legal and ethical framework in place. One of the concerns about algorithms is bias, conscious or unconscious, and they are generally biased towards ethnic minorities, and we think that's an important factor that we need to get our heads around. I think if we broaden it out though to some of the discussions were taking place earlier, I think the challenge we face is the general public wouldn't know an algorithm if they tripped over it in the street. I mean, it's an esoteric area. So although we who are involved in this area think the whole area of social license is an important one, and one that really governments should be working to develop an agreed approach to licensing. I think algorithmic transparency is rather like smoking was in the 70s or the 80s. So it was generally you know, who cared about it? Nobody cared about it. And it's taken us 30 or 40 years to get to the situation where, you know, we now have an environment in most developed countries where smoking is something that's sort of it's marginalized. And I think it's going to take a while before we get there to having the conversation in the wider community. Sadly, it's probably going to take quite a few scandals in order for it to happen. But I think that's the way that we can have the conversation. I think the role of organizations like Transparency International is to develop their dialogue with governments across the communities as a whole. That was it for me. I'll hand it back to you, Tony.
Thanks, Lawrence. You know, as a recovering public servant, I think there's a lot you can speak from both sides. But I really love the points you did pick up on around sort of issues around procurement, issues around facial recognition and data protection. And I hopefully, you know, Natalia and Fabrizio can also pick up on some of that, because we know it's come up in those jurisdictions as well. But around issues around algorithmic bias and accountability. So how do you move from transparency to accountability? And then what kind of right to recourse do communities have directly? And then how do you encourage communities to really sort of look at the challenges around use of algorithms and then get to right to recourse. A couple of questions have come in for Jared Jared, maybe you could take one and we can sort of get one at the end of our discussion when we come to a plenary Q&A. One question is, are there regulations in place to limit access to data between different government agencies? And the other question is around sort of how hard was it to get public consultation and getting people to engage with this process? Was there any foundational education you've undertaken to engage communities and especially around what this means for them, algorithmic transparency? So if you could maybe reflect on the second question, since it talks about this, and Lawrence, anything you want to weigh in on, and then I'd like to move on to Natalia and Fabrizio.
Sure. The second, I was going to start with the second question. It feels more
Anna,
easily answerable.
Yeah. So Anna, in case there's anything else you'd like to add, please do add in the chat. But Jared, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Sure. No, not at all. So I think that's really where the last reflection I added came from, is that it is hard to get the public engaged on something that, as Lawrence said, people are impacted by algorithms, but they're so complex and so technical that they don't understand them and understand the ways in which they're impacted. And so to then ask people to engage on something that puts a series of commitments around public agencies using algorithms, operational algorithms, I think it's hard to, actually not necessarily hard, but it requires you to demonstrate why that matters, why people should be concerned enough or engaged enough to want to submit to public engagement around something like the development of an algorithm charter. And so that's really why I reflected that I think, were we to do it again, I think one thing we could have done to get people more on board, more engaged, is to actually do that public education to help people to understand. Because I don't think it's a case of that people, as I said, people are becoming more concerned about algorithms. We clearly see that in public discourse. But I think you have to make that connection about them, why it matters to kind of help us to shape our policy responses, and why then their engagement and what they tell us can help to shape that policy mechanism. And kind of as an example, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but we have a digital council for Aotearoa New Zealand here that I help to support as part of my work. And they released their report about automated decision making recently, which was a kind of a large research project they undertook last year, where they held a lot of town halls, a lot of workshops with all sorts of different communities across New Zealand about these sorts of issues. And the report shows clearly that people, when you talk to people about what it actually means and how it impacts them on a day-to-day basis, people are engaged and they are concerned. They understand the benefits as well, and they actually are engaged, and they want to have their voices heard. but you've got to engage in a way that makes people engaged with the topic material, because it is so complex and technical. Sorry, I feel like I've said a whole lot of words in a roundabout sort of way, but I hope I've made sense.
No, I think there's certainly a lot to do. Lawrence, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think 98% of the population, at least, are blissfully ignorant. And I think 1% are broadly against any form of algorithms because of the intrusion it has in people's lives. And 1%, these are the 2% that actually know about this stuff, think they are fantastic because they're going to make everybody's lives better. So not only do we have a challenge of expanding the discourse to the bulk of the population, but we also have two very different and competing views about whether algorithms at heart are a good or a bad thing. And people come to that discussion wearing one of those two hats. And it's very difficult to actually, I think Statistics New Zealand done a very good job of finding a middle ground between those two strongly opposed, polarized viewpoints.
Absolutely. And I think if you look at the Jamboard, whether it's sort of, there's a whole set of countries that are looking at nascent set of policies. So Indonesia is the latest one. There's a national strategy on AI that's sort of in place right now. In I think that's South Africa. It says none in SA. There is a lot of use around AI and algorithms, but no entry points for people to come in. So I think there is that bridge between, raising awareness, but then what? What do you do after you've done that? I would like to bring in Fabrizio and Natalia here. And I think, I liked how Lawrence liked algorithmic transparency to smoking. People say open data, I like smoking as an analogy better, but let's go to maybe data ethics and open data. There's a lot, Natalia, maybe I'll start with you. How are you thinking in the UK? There was a scandal pretty recently around use of algorithms, and that brought it to the mainstream media. So adding to the list of other countries, the people putting on the board here. But then you've also seen a push, and the UK has been in the forefront of open data for a while, but not so much now in terms of algorithmic transparency. That's something you're starting. What are some lessons you're drawing where you're also thinking about doing this for your next OGP action plan? Tell us more.
Sure. So I think the A-level scandal definitely helped in terms of raising awareness of the use of algorithms in public sector more generally. However, we've recently run a public engagement exercise that actually showed that this rise of awareness was not as significant as we might have imagined, especially as people who genuinely do care about algorithms. As I was listening to Jared and Lawrence, I actually saw quite a few of the things that you pointed out to in terms of educating the public, raising awareness overall, and then how meaningfully engaging the public in the design of those policies. I've also noticed that in my work. So it's very interesting to hear that we're facing very similar challenges, actually. But in general, we do think that public engagement and raising awareness of the use of algorithms in the public sector is really, really essential for any algorithmic transparency work. And that's what we've been trying to do. So we made a commitment in the National Data Strategy where we announced that we are exploring the development of an appropriate and effective mechanisms to deliver transparency on the use of algorithms, facilitating decision-making in the public sector. And we then had a fully open round of consultations. So that was open for around 6 weeks, and people could send their replies and comment on this particular proposal. And we've also quite recently published a response to that. And actually the reaction to this proposal was overwhelmingly positive. So the majority of respondents supported this idea of making algorithmic decision-making more transparent. And many civil society organizations were actually very keen to work with us on that. So then we hosted a series of various workshops, and with help of some of our fantastic UK-based organizations, such as the Ada Lovelace Institute and others. So we first hosted workshops with civil society and academic experts in the field. And we then hosted events with government officials as well to brainstorm on how those transparency measures could actually look like in practice. However, we also decided that if the very final, the end, the kind of target audience of any algorithmic transparency measures is the general public, we actually needed to gain a better understanding of their knowledge and expectations in this field. So we very recently completed a public engagement project with the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation and Britain Things. And the goal of that project was to consider how the public sector can be meaningfully transparent about algorithmic decision-making. So we wanted to explore which algorithmic transparency measures would be really effective in increasing public understanding about the use of algorithms in the public sector, and also public trust. So we commissioned Britain Things, who used a deliberative process, as the initial surveys run by the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation actually revealed that there were very low levels of awareness about this topic among the public. And I think that sounds like something you've seen in New Zealand as well. But this is why we decided to go with a deliberative approach, because it was meant to gradually build up the participants' understanding and knowledge of the use of algorithms in the public sector. And eventually that led to participants co-designing solutions in the later stages of this project. So we used 3 particular use cases to test a range of various emotive responses. So we looked at policing, we looked at parking and recruitment. And we recruited members of the public from across the UK, and we had a mix of age, gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic group. We also had a mix of people with various levels of trust in institutions, various levels of digital literacy, and people with experience of interacting with some of the use cases, so recruiting, policing, or parking in the last 6 months, because we really wanted to understand how that would influence their attitudes to algorithmic transparency overall. And we engaged with them over a 3-week period, and the very final stage of this study was an in-depth co-designing session where they actually worked collaboratively to create prototypes of an algorithmic transparency model that reflected their needs and expectations. And this research has just concluded a couple of weeks ago, and the final report will be published later this month, so I won't go into too much detail now, and you'll be able to read all about it shortly. But a quick overview of main findings is that very similarly to what Lawrence was saying earlier, that particular research confirmed that overall there was a fairly low awareness or low understanding of the use of algorithms in the public sector. And trust in the use of algorithms in the public sector varied across different scenarios. So we can really see that the setting had a stronger influence on trust than any prior knowledge of trust or technology that this algorithm was deployed in. And also what I found particularly interesting was, 1 minute, okay, great. Despite the lack of personal interest in this algorithmic transparency information necessarily, because the participants were saying that actually they wouldn't really go through and read all the information about algorithms, but they would like that information to be available. And they would expect it to be there on the website if any journalists or any experts were to access it. And another really crucial point that came out of our work was that accessibility is a priority. And actually, we need to ensure that transparency information about the use of algorithms in the public sector is understandable, but also accessible. And this can be communicating this information in a digestible, easy, understandable manner, but also making it possible for different groups to find this information. For example, people with no internet connection, or people with no computers, or people with low digital literacy skills. So these are some of the issues that we've identified in this process, and we will now use this research to drive our future policy work on algorithmic transparency. And I'll stop now because I'm probably out of time. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Natalia. You covered some great sort of, I was very interested in the sectoral entry points of similar also, for instance, policing. We've seen that been used in other countries as well, and Jared also mentioned it. But also, I think the points around accessibility, so transparency for what, right? And where do you go from there? Fabrizio, a great point to bring you in. We've also had someone, Sasha Rovinant, talk about, well, we've talked a lot about the global north, which we have. In the global south, how do we see it? And I know Ilda has been doing some work in the region. Of course, our global study on algorithmic accountability has also seen sort of a few instances in the global south, but not many, at least in Latin America. Fabricio, tell us what we're seeing, especially in transition from sort of a lot of open data initiatives to algorithmic accountability. You're on mute, Fabricio.
Obviously, this is the story of these chats and of this place.
This is the story of the pandemic. Go ahead.
Yes, indeed. Buenos dias, and thank you very much for having me and organizing this, and to my previous colleagues who all made excellent points. So here, I'm based in Uruguay, but the region I work is one of the most unequal regions in the world. And it's not only unequal in terms of income, it is unequal in terms as well of opportunities. It is unequal in several ways. It is unequal in the way the government applies its power and it executes its laws. So it's a complex environment, and different countries might offer different situations. There are 20 of them in Latin America, so jurisdictions do vary. Now, the good news about this is that in the last 2 years, we have seen a wave of, let's say, a consultation approach to policies around AI. And this has led to at least 3 countries in this region, Colombia, Uruguay, and recently Brazil, to develop AI strategies that to some degree involve an approach about, or at least mentions, to accountability and fairness of algorithms. This is linked to an open and wide consultation process, or at least they aim to run an open and wide consultation process that put these issues into consideration. But that's not the common element, like processes in Argentina and Mexico, who were to some, in Argentina, a very sophisticated consultation effort, did not end up in a policy. And this has to do as well with, the let's say, electoral cycle in the region, the changes of government, which, to some degree, do not provide enough stability for some policies. Now, the reason we are here, like ILDA was set up to explore the use of data for development. That was already 8 years ago, so that's, it's a long time. So the reason we are here is that all these beautiful algorithms we are now discussing are based on data. And data, is just a representation of reality. And the situation about data in Latin America is complex. We recently ran the Latin American Open Data Barometer exercise, which essentially measures the availability of open data in the region. And the situation marginally improved, but the quality of data remains a problem. And this also remains a problem for all these experts, particularly in the public sector, designing and using algorithms. And to some degree, we do have some examples of early successes in terms of the use of, automation, mostly in public sector entities, because most of the processes around AI, which at least the evidence I have in this region is mostly machine learning, right? It's not AI as in Skynet or, the things I got to hear mostly, but this is mostly about machine learning. And the evidence I have here is that there are some exercise around automation. There are some exercise and evidence about the use of this for prediction, mostly for policy analysis. But so far that's limited. And naturally, we do have our fair share of of use in the security sector, mostly around, as mentioned by our colleagues in New Zealand, facial recognition, but also for crime prediction and so on. Now, in most of these cases, there is little governance around this. This is also another issue connected to this, that we do have a project exploring the use of data for the public purpose through machine learning techniques, and it's currently operating in Brazil, Mexico, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, and Chile. And the lack of regulation in these countries did not stop these projects running, but most of them use public data. Now, when you come to personal data, that's a different story. And to some degree, we're encountering that some projects, cannot go, further because there is clearly a vacuum in terms of lack of regulation in this area. a few Latin American countries have a strong protections in terms of privacy or data protection. Now that does not necessarily mean you have to copy paste GDPR regulation in Europe, but that means that we do need a discussion about this, and we are running a bit of research about that. So in the end, I think that what happens here is we are trying to understand from our perspective is, where does it make sense to use these technologies or techniques for development purpose, particularly in government areas? And how are we going to govern this? And an essential part of that is setting up a transparency and accountability framework. There is evidence that some people have used freedom of information requests to actually access code from government. And in some cases, they won this kind of legal approach. But it's very impractical. If we're going to sue governments every time we need to access their code to inspect them, it's going to be very, very. So I think that there is room to improve this kind of spaces. But I think it's early days as well, as my colleagues Janice and Soisik also mentioned. It's early days. It's an emerging policy field, and we still don't know a lot of what's going on. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Fabricio. That was really comprehensive. I think there are quite a few things you raised, and in the final round, because of time, in mopping up questions, I hope the other speakers can also pick up on some of the questions. So one is around sort of, I think, implementation of AI strategies and policies in the region, in the countries, the 3 countries you mentioned for sure, and there are some questions in the chat, including India. I think Jalakakar brought up questions. So what are some things countries can think of who are looking at sort of starting on the journey of consulting around AI strategies and policies? The other sort of the risks, especially around data governance and the lack of regulation therein, I think that's a really critical point. We've seen that in several Open Government Partnership member countries. The facial recognition question is a big one. I know there are other sessions in RightsCon that are going to be looking at that. And Daniel from Access Now also pasted a coalition that they've been building around that, or work around that. And so the final piece, I think, that sort of maybe we could look at as a panel, and maybe we could do a round of closing remarks, is one, if you could pick up on some of the questions there. For New Zealand in particular, there are a couple of other questions that have come in, especially around use of, I think, looking at emotional recognition and whether that's being looked at in revisiting the charter, but also an interesting question that's come up in regulating the private sector, because, and I think that's from Alia, saying, how do we draw a line between transparency and IP rights in algorithmic accountability, as the private sector is oftentimes involved in public sector algorithms. So questions there coming in, and they're coming in on a separate platform, so I will try and paste them for the panelists here. So maybe we go round and do a round of closing remarks, including any questions you might want to take from the chat. So maybe, do you want to start, Jenny, since you went fast and you've been quiet for a while?
Yes, definitely. There's lots of really, really good questions coming in. I think a couple of things I'd just love to pick up on. One is there's quite a few questions around this biometrics and facial recognition question, and also questions around what processes for kind of civic engagement and deliberation to flag as a model. My colleagues at the Ada Lovelace Institute recently, kind of last year, worked on the Citizens Biometrics Council, which was a public deliberative exercise over a long period to look at the use of biometrics, both in public and private sectors. But I think was really interesting and promising to see how some of these kind of longer term engagements, and I think a theme that has come up is this question around, there might be an education piece that needs to go with an a kind of ability for citizens to kind of input into processes. So I think that, and to the point that others have made about models they've seen so far, shows some really interesting, promising approaches. So I think touching that, I also really love this theme that people said around kind of how do we take the kind of high level policy goals and aspirations through into practical techniques. And I guess to flag the upcoming work we have with OGP and AI Now hopefully starts to give that kind of, lays out that landscape and a typology of what kind of interventions are there at the moment at that that level, and then hopefully I think allows us to collectively start asking what's not on that plate that could or should be, that about the kind of the new mechanisms and lower level tools that we might need. So I think that's all from me. Hope that covers some questions in there.
Thanks, it does indeed, Jenny, and thanks for keeping to time. Soysek, over to you.
Yes. Okay, I have 3 points, but I will try to be as short as possible. First, to the question of the balance between transparency and IP rights, I feel like it just reminds me of the movement public money, public code. I feel like we definitely need to prioritize transparency over IP rights in this situation, but this also involves having technology experts within government who are able to understand what they need to know about a system, because oftentimes contractors just leave with unopened code, and then government doesn't know what to do with it. And so this can be included in regulations. That would be my first very quick point. The second thing is I want to point out that France has French-speaking guidelines about practical guidance for agencies, and I can link that somewhere if there is somewhere to put resources, where we try to have just very practical guidance in terms of public registers, explicit mentions of algorithms, etc. And then the third question / provocation I would like to bring to the table is, we often talk about public involvement in regulation, but I also, my biggest question is, how do we involve the public in the design of algorithms and also in the decision of building them or not? Because oftentimes the public is involved once the decision of implementing an algorithm is made, and I feel like it should come more upstream. And I'm sorry, I went over time. I will stop now.
Thanks, Soysek. Yeah, it will be kicked out in 3 minutes off the platform. So Jared, over to you. Speedy conclusion, as much as
very speedy conclusion for me. I was just going to quite quickly touch, because I see there are a number of questions directed at New Zealand. There are a number of different regulations to limit data sharing across government. It's certainly, I can speak on, as Stats New Zealand, we receive a lot of data from different government agencies in the production of our national statistics. But yeah, no, there are regulations, and there is obviously a Privacy Act as well that that governs the privacy of people's information. In terms of the question about different communities engaged on the algorithm charter, I think it's probably more appropriate for me to quickly link to that report I mentioned that the Digital Council did around automated decision making, that engaged across a range of communities. And broadly speaking, given the time constraints, the concerns were the same. Around algorithmic transparency. There was one other thing about the emotional recognition.
Yeah, I might cut you short. Sorry.
No, sorry.
But yeah, maybe if the RightsCon colleagues can help us take some of your links and chats to the other platform. Lawrence.
So I'd just say you don't know how deep a puddle is until you step into it. Transparency International in Europe put together a paper called Algorithmic Transparency and Accountability, which actually traverses the ground that we've traversed today and concludes that both transparency and accountability are really challenging. So I think talking about linking resources, we should link to that as well.
Perfect. Yeah, and over to you, Natalia, and maybe I'll collect these resources and we'll send them over to link to our session. Natalia.
My final line is that public engagement is absolutely key in this work, and we need to explore more deliberative and innovative participation methods when developing algorithmic transparency work. And OGP national action plans could be one vehicle we could use in this process as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Love the OGP plug, Natalia. Fabrizio.
Garbage in, garbage out. Think about who is building your data and think about how inclusive is that. Otherwise, we are going to end up automating exclusion and unfairness in our government systems.
Fantastic. That was a pithy conclusion, and I recognize we're completely out of time. Jenny had a great idea of putting some of the resources the panelists mentioned into the Jamboard, since everyone here has the link. Thank you for your fantastic questions. Thank you very much to the panel for being up at all hours and having dinner and coffee, morning coffee with us. And we hope we can continue the conversation. There's a roundtable that we're also organizing. Reach out to any of us if you have if you're interested in digging deeper. Thanks again, and have a good rest of your day.